The wind came up through the shaft first, before the sound of them reached me. A long draw of cold air, rising 60 feet from the boot pit to the cupola, like the whole elevator was breathing me in. I had the lantern turned low, the way my brother taught me, so the glass wouldn't crack from the cold snapping in against the flame, and by that thin light, I could see my own breath, and, past it, the timber wall of the head house, where the boards had gone silver gray, with 40 years of prairie weather. That was when I heard them, not one wolf, a number I couldn't count from sound alone, moving through the frozen grass around the base of the elevator, their voices rising and falling like men arguing in another room. I did not move. I had learned that much by then. That stillness 60 feet in the air is its own kind of armor, that a wolf does not look up. My brother was 2 floors below me, in the boot, checking the sacks we'd wedged against the grain leg to break the wind, and I did not call down to him. I only sat with my knees against my chest and the Henry rifle across my lap, loaded, though I did not believe I would need it, and I let the lantern light move slow across the timbers, the way it does when your hand is not quite steady. That was how I found the name. It was cut into the crossbeam above the manlift door, half finished, the letters gone rough, where the knife had lost its edge, or the man had lost his patience. J. Hall. And then nothing, as if whoever carved it had been called away, or had simply stopped believing it mattered to finish. I did not know that night what that name would come to mean to us, or that by spring we would know more about the man who cut it than the town 40 miles south had known in 60 years. I did not know we would climb this same head house in worse cold than this, or that a dead man's ledger would end up deciding what kind of men we meant to be. All of that was still ahead of us, folded up in the dark, the way the wolves were folded into the grass below. But I promise you the whole of it, in its order, the way it happened. It started 3 months before that night, in the last week of September, when my brother and I came down off the Bear Paw benchlands with $11 between us, 2 packs gone thin at the seams, and no roof in sight before the snow, and found, standing alone against a sky already going the color of iron, an elevator nobody had touched in a decade. Tuesday, the 9th of November, came in gray and low, the sky sitting down on the benchland like it meant to stay a while, and by the time we made the last mile of frozen wagon track, we could see our breath going out ahead of us in ragged little clouds, faster than we were walking. The elevator stood maybe 400 yards off the old grade, 6 stories of gray, checked lumber rising up out of the coulee grass, like something that had grown there instead of been built, and the wind coming down off the sweetgrass hills hit it broadside and made a sound low in the throat, like a man breathing through his teeth. We stopped at the base of it and set our packs down in the frost, and I remember my brother crouching to look at the foundation timbers before he ever looked up at the cupola, because that was the kind of man he was. Always the ground first, always what a thing was standing on before what it was reaching toward. The sills were rotted maybe 2 inches in on the north corner, sound everywhere else. He said as much, out loud, the way he did when he was deciding something, and wanted a witness to it, even if the witness was only me. We took stock there in the wind, because there wasn't going to be a better moment for it. $11, down to $9.40 after the tin of coffee and the 12 pounds of cornmeal we'd bought off a Hutterite family near Ophir 8 days before. A hand axe with the handle bound in wire, a skinning knife apiece. 106 cartridges for the sharps, counted twice because the count mattered more than almost anything else we owned. And the rifle itself, a .50 caliber, the barrel gone dull with handling but the action still tight, still true. The one thing our father had left us that hadn't been sold, traded, or lost between Ohio and here. 2 wool blankets each, 1 oilskin between us, a coil of rope 40 feet long, a hatchet, a fry pan, and a Bible neither of us read, but neither of us would leave behind either. 40 miles south, lay Cutbank Coulee, a town we hadn't seen yet and wouldn't for some weeks. North and west, the passes were already choking with the first real snow, and a man coming down off the bench that morning at Rocky Boys had told us at a fire the night before that the High-Line freight roads would be shut inside 2 weeks, maybe less if the wind kept building the way it had been. My brother stood at the base of that elevator a long while, hands in his coat, looking up at the cupola like it might tell him something, and then he said, the only sentence that mattered that whole gray afternoon, that we weren't going to find 4 walls and a roof better than this one, anywhere between here and the mountains, and that a man foolish enough to keep walking into a Montana winter, looking for something finer, deserved what the snow gave him. The town, when we finally walked into it 11 days later for salt and coffee and a length of stovepipe wire, wasn't much. A mercantile with a false front peeling like sunburned skin, a log church with no steeple, 16 or 17 buildings strung along a single street that hadn't seen grading in years. A man named Ansel Voth ran the mercantile, or what was left of running it. He was 70 if he was a day, hands spotted and shaking faintly, even when they were still, and he watched us come in with the particular attention of a man who counts every stranger as either trouble or a story he hasn't heard yet. He weighed our coffee on a scale that looked older than he was, and when my brother mentioned, just to make conversation, that we'd taken up in the old Bannerman elevator north of the coulee, Voth's hands stopped on the scale entirely. "You're sleeping in that thing," he said. Not a question. My brother said we were, and that we'd shored the lift shaft and patched the cupola glass with oiled canvas, and that it beat a canvas tent 40 ways to Sunday with the wind doing what it had been doing. Voth set the coffee sack down slow, like it had gotten heavier. He said there wasn't a soul in the coulee who'd sleep under that roof for $100 gold, and that we ought to know why before we spent another night there, though he said it in the flat way of a man who half expects to be laughed at for saying it at all. Then he told us, not the whole of it, just a piece, the way old men give out a story a coin at a time to see if you're worth the rest. 13 years back, in the winter of 1873, the company's man out there, the agent, he called him, never a name, had given away every bushel of grain in that elevator to a town that was starving. Not sold, given. And when the company found out, come spring, they called it theft and sent men looking for him, and the men never found him, and neither had anyone since. Voth said the coulee owed that man more than it ever paid him, and that some folks still walked half a mile out of their way, rather than pass under that cupola after dark. My brother asked what happened to him. Voth just shook his head and said some things a man doesn't get told twice, and went back to weighing the coffee like the subject had closed itself. I didn't say anything the whole walk back, 40 miles of frozen wagon ruts and my brother's boots cracking through the crust ahead of me, but I kept turning it over, a company man, alone at the top of that shaft, doing 60 feet of good nobody would ever thank him for, and then just gone, like the wind that had been building all week finally found a door and walked through it. We got back to the elevator a little past 4, the light already going that flat gray. It goes before a Montana dusk in December, and my brother didn't say a word about Voth or the story, just set down the coffee and the nails and stood looking up at the leg like he was reading a letter written in a language he half knew. The grain leg ran the full height of the structure, boards and belting meant to carry bushels up into the head house, and most of it had gone soft with rot, where the snow had gotten in through a gap in the siding, some years back, by the look of the water stains, maybe 4, maybe 6. He put his hand flat against one of the boards, and it gave like wet bread. He didn't say anything about that either. The latter was worse. Rungs nailed in sometime before either of us was born, oak gone gray and split, 2 of them snapped clean through, and hanging by 1 nail apiece, swinging a little when the wind came up through the shaft. I counted 11 rungs missing outright between the ground floor and the second landing, out of what should have been maybe 40 to the top. My brother climbed the first 20 feet anyway, testing each one with his boot before he put his weight on it, and I stood below with my hand on the ladder rail, like that would do a thing for him if it gave. The cupola at the top was sealed, boarded over from inside, which struck me as strange even then, though I didn't think hard on it yet. 6 windows up there, 4 of them boarded, 2 of them just black with grime, and old cobwebbing frozen into lace. My brother came back down slow, boots ringing on the iron treads at the base, and stood a minute working his jaw the way he does when he's totaling something up in his head that isn't numbers. We got $51 between us, most of it his from the Butte contract, and it was November the 9th, 1886, with the first real cold not even arrived yet. He said we'd need lumber we didn't have money for, and rope we didn't have either. And instead of turning around, he pointed up at the leg and said we'd take her apart, plank by plank, save what timber was sound, and build back what wasn't, working through till she'd hold a man's weight, top to bottom. I asked him why we'd bother, when a soddy or a line shack would keep us just as warm for half the trouble, and he didn't answer that so much as look at me the way he'd looked at that ladder, like the not knowing was its own kind of weight he meant to carry, plank by plank, the same as the rest of it. Cold iron ticked somewhere above us, settling, and frozen dust sifted down through a crack in the siding and caught the last gray light like something falling that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to. We started at the head house, because that was where the roof still held, and a man works better with something over him, even if that something is full of holes. My brother went at the grain chute with a pry bar, working loose the boards that had swollen and split and gone soft with 40 winters of damp, and I took the corner where the old desk sat, its drawers stuck shut with rust and rot, and worked them open one at a time with the flat of my knife. Most of what came out was nothing. Mouse nests, a broken lantern glass, a tally book so water-stained the numbers had bled into each other like something drowned. But in the bottom drawer, under a coil of wire gone to orange scale, there was a slip of paper that hadn't rotted the way the rest had, folded twice, tucked flat against the wood, where the damp couldn't quite reach it. I unfolded it careful as I could because it wanted to tear along the crease, and did anyway. A clean split right through the middle of it, so what I held was really 2 halves that had once been one sheet. Requisition, it said at the top, in a hand gone brown with age but still legible, still a man's hand, and not a clerk's careless scratch. Below it, a number, 4,200 bushels, and under that, initials, J.H. Nothing more. No date I could find on either half, though the paper itself looked older than anything else in that drawer, older than the wire, older than the tally book. My brother came over and took it from me without asking, the way he does, and held it up to what light came through the chute opening, and didn't say anything for a while. 4,200 bushels is not a small number. It's not a man ordering feed for his own stock or seed for a garden plot. That's a number for a company, for a town, for something bigger than one man standing alone in a grain house, 60 feet above the prairie, with nobody to answer to, and nobody coming to check his figures. I didn't know it then, standing in that cold with frozen dust still sifting down past us. But that number belonged to a winter 13 years gone, the winter of 1873, when the supply train out of Fort Benton never made it past Highwood before the snow closed over the grade, and stayed closed for 6 weeks. And a settlement 40 miles east called Cutbank Coulee sat with empty root cellars and a schoolhouse turned sick house, and nothing between them, and starving, but whatever grain a company man named Halloran had locked up in a building that wasn't his to give away. My brother folded the 2 halves back together, careful, the way you'd fold something you weren't sure you had the right to unfold in the first place, and set it on the desk, and looked up at the ladder again. The temperature dropped 9 degrees between the Tuesday we found that first page and the Thursday after, and it did not stop there. My brother had taken to reading the thermometer nailed to the scale house post each morning, before he'd even built up the fire. And on the fourth morning of that stretch, he came back inside with frost already whitening his eyebrows, and said the mercury had gone down past 20 below, and looked like it meant to keep going. We had maybe 11 days of hard lumber work left on the cupola shutters when that cold came in, and we did not have 11 days anymore. The wind came out of the north without any patience for a man's schedule, and it carried something on it that first night that neither of us named out loud, though we both heard it. A long call, thin and carrying, off toward the willow brake where the coulee bent. By the second night there were two voices answering each other, and by the third there were three, and one of them was close enough that the horses picketed under the lean-to shifted and stamped until near midnight. My brother did not say much about it. He only started working faster, and I matched him, and we stopped taking the noon meal sitting down. We hung the last of the shutter boards on a Sunday, the 12th of December by his count, with our hands so stiff from cold that we had to breathe on the nail heads before we could feel where to strike them. And that night, we did not sleep in the scale house at all. We carried our blankets and the tin stovepipe up the ladder, up past the bin floor and the dust-choked gears, up into the cupola itself, and we slept there for the first time, with the shutters latched and the wind working at the seams like something with fingers. It was not warm, but it was 60 feet up, and whatever moved below, and there is a particular kind of comfort in height, even when the cold follows you there. I lay awake a long while that first night, listening to the building talk. Old wood does that, settling and complaining under weight and frost. And somewhere under all of it, thin and far off but unmistakable, I heard the voices again, closer to the base now than they'd been from the ground. My brother heard it too. I could tell by how still he went, the way a man goes still when he's decided not to say a thing out loud that both of you already know. After that first night, it became the shape of our days, without either of us deciding it that way. Work until the light failed, haul what we needed up the ladder, latch the shutters, wait out the dark 60 feet above whatever hunted the coulee floor, and come morning climb back down, to find the snow at the base, scored with tracks neither of us had put there. The tracks were the kind of thing a man could talk himself out of in daylight, and I did, most mornings, right up until the morning we found the second cache. It was my brother who found it, behind a warped board in the head house, where the bootjack ledger had been tucked before, only this time deeper, wedged where the cupola brace met the joist, wrapped twice in oilcloth gone stiff as bark. Tuesday, the 8th of December, by my count, though out there a man's count of days gets loose around the edges. Inside were letters, not ledgers, a thinner stack, maybe 30 pages, the ink browned but the hand steady, a hand that wrote like it expected to be believed. The first letters were to the company, Bannerman Grain and Elevator, Fort Benton office, dated through the fall of 1873. Requests, then demands, then something close to begging, though the man never let the wording slip that far. He wrote of the coulee families down to their last flour by November, of the freight contractor who wouldn't run a wagon that far north before spring for less than $400 the company wouldn't spend, of children he named, Delphine Ostrander, the Petrie boy, both the Koenig girls, sick from eating what wasn't food. The company's replies, when they bothered to send any, were short. Hold the reserve. Relief will come with the spring thaw. The reserve is not to be distributed without authorization from Fort Benton. There was no authorization. There was a date, the 11th of January, 1874, after which the letters stopped being letters to the company and became something else. A ledger page, folded in with the rest, headed in the same steady hand. Grain issued, Cutbank Coulee, by name, by bushel, by household. Ostrander, 4 bushels. Petrie, 6. Koenig, 5. Down the page, 41 households. Every bushel of the company's held reserve, accounted for against a person and a need, not a dollar owed. At the bottom, no explanation, no defense, Just a line that read, "Reserve exhausted this date. All accounted for above." I read it twice by the lamp and then a third time, and my brother read it over my shoulder without asking, the way he does when he already half knows what it says and wants the words anyway. "He gave it all away," I said, though there wasn't any need to say it aloud. "Every bushel," my brother said, "to people the company never fed once." Outside, the wind had picked up again, working the shutters, and somewhere far off under it, closer than I liked, one of the tracked things below answered another, a long, low sound that didn't belong to a dog and wasn't quite a wolf either, or was every kind of wolf at once. I set the papers back in the oilcloth and didn't sleep for a long while, thinking less about what was moving in the dark below the ladder than about a man 40-some winters past, sitting where I was sitting, writing down names instead of numbers, knowing exactly what it would cost him, and doing the arithmetic anyway. Morning came gray and windless, the kind of stillness that follows a hard blow, and my brother said we'd best carry what we'd found down to the coulee before the weather turned again. We wrapped the ledger in the oilcloth and then in a spare shirt besides, and I carried it against my chest the whole 3 miles down like it might bruise. Cutbank Coulee wasn't much. A store, a chapel with a bell nobody rang anymore, a scatter of soddies and one frame house that had somehow kept its paint. The schoolhouse sat at the north end, smoke coming thin from its pipe, and it was there a woman met us on the step, before we'd even called out, like she'd been watching the trail out of habit. She gave her name as Etta Pryor, and said it the way people say names they've had to correct other folks on for years. Full and unhurried, Miss Etta Pryor, schoolteacher, going on 30 years now. She was maybe 60, gray hair pinned back hard, hands stained at the fingers with ink and chalk both. She looked at the bundle under my arm before she looked at either of our faces. "You've been up at the elevator," she said, not a question. We told her some of it, the cupola, the wolves, the ledgers we'd found stacked behind the brace. Careful with the words, the way you're careful walking ice, you haven't tested. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally held out the requisition slip, the one signed at the bottom in that same square, deliberate hand as the ledger, she took it from me like it weighed more than paper should. She didn't ask permission before she disappeared into the schoolhouse, came back with a tin box, and inside it were pages, receipts, an old freight manifest, a letter with the ink gone brown, and she laid the requisition slip down next to a receipt from the general store, dated 18 and 72, and I saw it before she said it. Same hand, same way of crossing the sevens, same slant, leaning left, like the man had learned his letters from someone left-handed. "I've been keeping these 13 years, she said, since my father passed. He never would say the man's name straight out, only called him the agent, like saying Halloran might call something down on the house." She looked up at us both. "I was 8 years old, the winter he gave the grain away. I remember the wagons coming down off that hill in the snow, and I remember my mother crying, and I did not understand until I was near grown why she was crying from relief." She set the slip down careful, like it might still burn. "What I don't have," she said, "is what happened to him after. The company came looking that spring, and then he isn't in any record again. Not a death, not a departure, not a warrant served. A man like that doesn't just stop existing." She looked toward the window, toward the hill and the elevator standing dark against it. Unless the mountain kept him too. We were still sitting with that thought, the mountain keeping a man the way it keeps everything else, quiet and complete, when the door of the schoolhouse opened without a knock, and a man came in shaking snow off a coat too fine for the country. He gave his name as Coyle, representing the Northern Improvement Company, out of Helena, and he said it the way some men say, a church they belonged to. He had a leather case under his arm, and boots that had never split a cord of wood. My brother didn't stand. I didn't either. Coyle said he'd heard, from a man at the trading post in Sweetgrass, that 2 drifters had been working the old Bannerman elevator on the Cooley Road. He said the company he served was surveying old land grants ahead of the rail line coming through in the spring, and that certain grants, the Bannerman grant among them, had gone unclaimed and unrenewed since the Panic of '73. He said this the way a man reads a weather report, like it concerned no one in the room. "Any papers you found in that elevator," he said, "any ledgers, any correspondence, the company would pay fair money. $50 for the lot. No questions on where you found it." He smiled when he said $50, like it was a kindness. I felt my brother go still beside me, the particular stillness he gets when a thing matters more than his face will show. "What's $50 buy you?" my brother said. "That we don't already know?" Coyle's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "Proof of negligence," he said. "Proof the company abandoned its obligations here, failed to maintain the grant, failed to account for its grain. Makes the old title easy to clear. Easy titles move fast when the rail comes." He looked at the school teacher, at the slip of paper still on the table, and something in his eyes sharpened, cataloging it before she could fold it away. "Records like that," he said, "are worth considerably more to the right party than $50. If I'm honest, I'm authorized to go to 200. Nobody spoke. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had come up again, working at the shutters the way it worked at everything in that country, patient and without malice, the way water works at stone. My brother looked at me, not at Coyle, and I understood the question in it without a word passing, and I understood, too, that whatever we said next in that room would decide more than $50, or 200, could ever account for. The question my brother's look carried didn't need Coyle in the room to answer, because we already knew what was in the ledger and what it wasn't. And knowing that had happened 4 days before, 60 feet up, with the wind doing to the cupola shutters exactly what it was doing now to the trading posts. We'd been resetting the last brace on the north side of the head house, the wood so cold it rang like iron when the hammer struck true, when my brother's hand found a gap behind the timber that shouldn't have been there. Not rot, a cavity, cut on purpose, the width of a hand, packed with oilcloth gone stiff as bark. He worked it loose with 2 fingers, slow, the way you'd draw a splinter from under a nail, and set it on the plank floor between us like it might still be listening. Inside was a ledger, Bannerman Grain and Elevator Company stamped faint on the cover, the leather gone the color of creek mud. We didn't open it there. We waited for the lamp, for the stove, for the kind of light that lets a man read without guessing at his own eyes. That night my brother turned the pages while I held the lantern close enough that our breath fogged the glass. Columns of bushels, dates in a careful, tired hand, the numbers falling through the fall of 1873, like a man running out of stairs. Then the entries stopped answering to arithmetic at all. Grain given to the Peterson family, 11 sacks. Grain given to the widow Alcott, 6 sacks. No charge entered. No charge ever entered again after that. Page after page of a company's whole reserve walking out the door in the arms of people my brother pointed at, like he could see them standing in the Cooley snow, and at the bottom of the last full page, in the same hand, smaller, like he'd pressed the pen harder to make it hold. Given, not stolen. Let the ice have what's left. Nothing after it but blank pages, stiff with age, never touched again. My brother closed the ledger with both hands, gentle, like closing something's eyes. Neither of us said the word thief out loud, because it had never fit. Not once we'd read that line. Not once we understood a man had sat alone in that same cupola with the whole company's fortune behind him, and chosen the Cooley over the ledger balance, knowing exactly what it would cost him, and writing it down anyway so that someone, someday, 60 feet up and years too late, would know it wasn't theft at all. Which was the thing sitting on the table now, folded small, while Coyle waited on our answer. $50. Coyle set the number down soft, like it might spook if he said it too hard, and told us the surveyors were 3 days out from Cutbank Coulee and would pay double that for anything showing old grain company negligence. Clear title, clean books, no widow's claim standing in the way of the line they meant to run. He wasn't a cruel man. He said it the way a man says the weather, like it was just the shape of things, and I noticed he didn't look at the ledger while he said it, only at us. My brother turned the ledger over once in his hands, the way you'd turn a stone you weren't sure was worth the carrying. "It's not for sale," he said. Coyle didn't argue. He'd dealt with us long enough to know when a thing was closed. He finished his coffee, said the roads would be soft by Tuesday, and left the depot with his hat set the way it always was, and I understood, watching him go, that he'd have taken the 50 and thought no worse of himself for it, and that was the difference between him and us, not virtue exactly, just which debts a man feels bound to. We rode the 11 miles to the schoolhouse in a thaw wind that smelled of wet pine and horse, and found Miss Etta Pryor grading slates at a desk too small for a woman her age, 61 that spring by her own count, the only soul left in the coulee who'd known him as a boy before the company ever put a title on him. She read the ledger the way you'd read a letter from someone long dead who'd somehow still managed to send it. She didn't cry. She held it against her chest for a moment, the way you'd hold something warm on a cold morning, and then she stood and said, "We'd better come see the marker." It was a cairn at the edge of the burying ground, stones stacked and restacked every spring, for longer than anyone could say who'd started it. No name on it, never had been, just tended, generation after generation, because someone once told someone else it mattered, and no one had ever asked why past that. She matched the hand in the ledger to a letter kept folded in the schoolhouse Bible, the same slant, the same pressed weight on certain words, and stood over that nameless pile of stone with her hand flat against it like she was checking for a pulse. 60 years, she said, and nobody thought to write it down. She looked up at us then, and I understood the coulee wasn't done with us yet. The marker went up on a Tuesday, the 2nd of April, 1887. Ground still hard enough that 4 men had to loosen it with a mattock before they could set the post. No stone from a quarry, no letters cut by a professional hand, just a plank of seasoned pine, and on it, burned in with a hot iron by the schoolteacher's own steady hand, a name none of us had heard spoken aloud until that week, and under it, 2 words. Gave freely. The coulee stood around it the way people stand around a fire, not saying much, and somebody's grandmother left a jar of dried beans at the base of the post, which nobody explained and which I didn't ask about, because some things you let be. We spent our last 4 days at the elevator, finishing what we'd started, packing grease into the headhouse bearings, splicing the last frayed foot of belt, setting the ladder rungs so a man coming up in the dark wouldn't put a boot through rotted wood. On the last evening, we climbed to the cupola together, the 2 of us, same as that first night the wolves had run below us, and we hadn't known yet what kind of building we were sitting in. We filled the lamp, trimmed the wick, and lit it, and watched the light throw itself out over 60 feet of dark toward the coulee's scattered lamps, small and steady, like something answering back. We left the following morning, the 9th of April, our packs no heavier than they'd been in November, though I'd have argued they were carrying more. We didn't take payment from the railway men who came through later that spring, asking after old company ledgers and old company debts. We told them the elevator was sound and the land was settled and left it there, because some debts aren't owed to men who'd pay to bury them twice. I think about that lamp most nights, wherever we've made camp since. A man alone up there for years, heaping account of grain that was never really his to give, giving it anyway because the alternative was watching people he'd grown up beside starve in a country that wasn't going to forgive anybody for anything. Nobody paid him back in his lifetime. Somebody's paying him back now, 60 years late, which I've come to think is the only kind of interest that ever really mattered. That's the whole of it. If you've got a brother, or someone who's stood beside you the way one does, you already know most of what this story was trying to say. If you've got your own tale of a hard winter, an old debt, or a name that got left off a marker too long, tell it below. We'll read every one. Subscribe if you want to keep walking with us. There's more country ahead, and more of it keeping quiet than you'd think.